Good evening. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Erin Carlston. I'm the head of the Department of English and Drama at the University of Auckland. I extend my greetings and I welcome you to this marvelous setting. This event is part of a new initiative to connect the Auckland War Memorial Museum more closely to the University of Auckland. And I'd like to thank the museum and also the Hood Foundation, among many others, for making tonight's event possible. It's my very great pleasure to introduce tonight Professor Janet M. Davis, who comes to us from the University of Texas at Austin, where she is Distinguished Teaching Professor of American Studies and History. Born in Hawaii, Professor Davis has had a rich and varied career since, including, I learned today, a 3-year stint as a flight attendant for Northwest Airlines, which I was thinking must have been really good practice for teaching, because you had to spend a lot of time talking to people who were staring at their phones and not paying any attention to the important information you were trying to convey to them. She earned her PhD in U.S. history from the University of Wisconsin and has been teaching at UT, the University of Texas, since 1998. Davis is the recipient of numerous awards, far too numerous for me to list, for both her teaching and her research, including, to name just a few, the Choice Outstanding Academic Title Book Awards in both 2003 and 2017, and the 2016 Regents Outstanding Teaching Award. She's the author of, among other publications, the multiple award-winning book, The Circus Age, Culture and Society Under the American Big Top, and the editor of a collected volume on the life of circus performer Tiny Klein, which I have to go get just because I love her name. Her current work in progress is tentatively titled Jaws Mania, and it's on the history of relations between humans and sharks. Professor Davis has published opinion pieces in the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, the Smithsonian Magazine, and other media outlets. And she regularly serves as a public humanities consultant for film, television, festival, and museum projects. Most recently, she consulted on a 2-part series, The Circus, which aired nationally on PBS in 2018, nationally in the United States on PBS, and which, and I did check this, we can now view here on Netflix NZ. Her lecture tonight draws on yet another of her award-winning books, published in 2016 on the 150th anniversary of the establishment of the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. That book also provides the title for her talk tonight, The Gospel of Kindness, Animal Welfare, and the Making of Modern America. Please join me in welcoming Professor Janet Davis.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, Professor Carlston, and wow, it's just such a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm really just so grateful, and I just want to give my thanks to Professor Frost for the invitation to be here, for the amazing hospitality and the conference. Professor Teon, also amazing. This conference has just been incredibly generative and exciting and really invigorating, so I'm having a great time. And I also would like to thank the Hood Foundation for the generosity in making this possible, and also the collaboration with the Auckland Museum. I thank Greta Bachman-Fuller so much for everything to make tonight happen. I mean, from sending the wrong PowerPoint to her graciousness in making everything work, and to be here in this beautiful setting is just such a great pleasure. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you all very much. So I wanted to just begin with a couple of quick notes. And also, I want to thank you as well, Professor Carlston, for being a co-sponsor for me being here too. So thank you. And with that, I also just want to begin by talking a bit about what you're going to see, because I have a lot of images, okay? Over the next probably 45 minutes, you're going to see a bunch of different images that might look unfamiliar in today's landscape, today's world of animal advocacy, and the majority of them come from a a publication that first began in 1868 called Our Dumb Animals, which to our modern ears does not sound very much in the service of advocacy, but it's using an older idea of dumb as unable to speak. And the magazine's motto was, "We speak for those who cannot speak for themselves." And it was published by the Massachusetts SPCA, and its editor and its chief was a man by the name of George Angel. He was the MSPCA's he was the founder and also its first president. So he's going to figure as a kind of through line throughout my talk this evening, okay? And so he also is going to be someone who will launch the talk. But I also have a couple other initial things before I proceed. I want to stress something that it's fascinating to think about. This notion of a gospel of kindness is a term that I didn't create. This is a term that the animal advocates themselves used repeatedly during this era of animal advocacy. And so it was a synthetic vision regarding the least among us of biblical stewardship. So the centrality of a kind of Christian and then over time becoming pretty culturally pluralistic as the movement expands around the world too. So it's a fascinating kind of synthetic movement that is, very faith-based of stewardship. And it links generations of social reform as well. So even though I'm going to talk about a large swath of time, the antebellum era, before the Civil War in America, is a really foundational era to link future generations of advocacy. So we'll be beginning there. My final note before I go on is that both George Angel and his successor, Reverend Francis Rowley, worked really closely with groups around the world, including here in Auckland. And so they corresponded on the pages of Our Dumb Animals. Again, they would publish letters from animal advocates here in New Zealand and would talk about sending copies of Our Dumb Animals for use in Auckland public schools and in other locations as well. So this kind of transnational flow is very much a part of the movement. And it's been just really fun to read these connections across space and time. And we're part of a conference, so I mentioned that at the beginning, and entitled, for those of you who are part of the public and not with us in this 2-day event, it's called Community, Conflict, and the Meaning of America. And indeed, animal advocacy does evoke all of these questions about what it means to be American. Community and conflict are often very much part, both community formation, ideas of national belonging, but also ideas of inclusion and exclusion, and also claims of citizenship based around these ideas about the least among us. So they're all very interconnected, and I hope those connections come through. So with that, I am going to begin. Okay, long preamble. So let's go back in time to Valentine's Day, 1827. George Angel Sr., Baptist minister, was cantering home, facing a stiff, icy headwind as he almost collapses upon arrival at his home in Massachusetts, wintertime. It was tough going. He walked gingerly into the house after he took care of his horse, put his horse in the stable, and his wife Rebecca was really alarmed at what she saw, and this is what she wrote. He complained of cold, chills, a violent headache, and was soon confined to his bed. He gave me orders relative to medical aid and soon was deprived of his reason. 2 days later, Reverend Angel was near death, and Rebecca wrote, "Toward morning Sabbath day the 18th, he fell into a sweet, death-like sleep at 8:30, entered out and humbly trust on a Sabbath of rest in the mansion of glory." And he passed away. And Rebecca Angel now was a single mom. She had a 3.5-year-old son. There he is as a much older person, George Angel, and the future founder and president of the MSPCA. And left with little means, Rebecca was forced into an agonizing decision. She had to put George in the care of relatives while she went back to work as a teacher. And so George essentially moved around over the course of his childhood, and he would write to his mother, and she would write back to him. And I read those letters of that correspondence in an attic of the current day MSPCA in Jamaica Plain in Boston. And they're a remarkable correspondence. And Rebecca worried ceaselessly about the state of young George's soul. She was so worried about him not attending the many revivals that were in his areas where he was living. And she'd say, "George, is there any revival in the church where you worship or in any of the churches in the city of Boston? So do be induced to attend where God is pouring out his Holy Spirit and strive for an interest in the Savior's love. Now the Savior stands with arms extended to receive you if you will only come to him," unquote. And so she would be writing these pleading letters like, "Please, don't go to the swimming hole. Don't read those magazines and those youthful books. Instead, get thee to a revival." And then she would end these pleas to get to the revivals with very prosaic bits like, "Are you concerned about the state of your soul? I send the socks. The ones that needed darning, they have been fixed. So here they are." And so it would be this kind of correspondence. And so I mention all of this because I want to stress the centrality of the Second Great Awakening, this period of religious ferment, roughly from 1790 to 1840 in the United States, but it was a transnational phenomenon as well. There were revivals across the Atlantic as well. And that this period of revivalism and extraordinary reform was something that really shapes the kind of future advocacy efforts of many people who I'm going to be talking about today. And they participated both in revivals, but they also participated in the social movements that were surrounding this kind of emphasis on free moral agency, rejecting predestinarian thought of the past with a kind of belief in one's ability to act as a moral free agent. So in the realms of asylum reform, temperance, and abolition, these are very important antebellum connections to the future of the animal welfare movement. And theologians of the awakening also were very focused on animals. You probably haven't heard about this, but it's fascinating. Timothy Dwight, president of Yale College, he talked about the need for Sunday's rest for livestock. Prohibitions on cockfighting. Charles Grandison Finney, another theologian of the revival, also stressed kindness to animals as important to any kind of moral improvement. And the other thing I want to stress here too is that this is also an era in which the early kind of wave of local legislation really takes off in the United States based on English precedents. So in 1822, Humanity Dick Martin, in England, he sponsored a bill, an anti-cruelty bill toward cattle and other livestock. And that becomes a kind of blueprint for what you see being passed in the United States, also here in New Zealand as well. So there's a kind of transnational legal connection too that I think is really important to consider as well. And so I want to talk then about some of those antebellum antecedents real quickly, one of which is temperance, okay? So here we have the silent appeal. This is from a songster that was for children. So the Bands of Hope was a children's temperance group and whose members gathered together to sing, read scripture, pray, and pledge to avoid intoxicating substances. And they stressed animal kindness as a kind of moral complement to sobriety. And so in this scene, we see young Nellie Montgomery and her faithful old house dog who's begging. Okay, you can see there's begging going on, who politely begs for a bit of the girl's bowl of bread and milk. And Nellie immediately fed her dog because she was a good caretaker. And then here's what it says in the copy accompanying this image. The dog seemed to be very grateful to her, thoughtful kindness of heart and ready sympathy. We hope all our young volunteers will be as kind to these noble animals, for they all love cold water, which is capitalized, and never drink whiskey, smoke tobacco, or swear. Little Nellie's dog loves the sparkling water of Silver Creek better than the old toper loves his bottle, unquote. And so rejecting vice, the water-loving house dog, was a virtuous exemplar for young children. So sobriety among animals. And future animal advocates also venerated the antebellum asylum reformer Dorothea Dix. And I want to show you something. This is a monument that George Angel and the MSPCA erected in her memory. And it was a horse's trough, a water trough for urban horses. And one of the things that happens is that Dorothea Dix did investigative journalism into the conditions of asylums where mentally ill were housed, people with physical disabilities, often chained to their beds, and used, the language used to describe their conditions was of animal-like language. And so this becomes a kind of intervention as part of this growing gospel of kindness in this realm. And nowhere was this explicit visualization of the suffering body more apparent than in the abolition movement. This is the place where a new literary genre known as the cruelty narrative brought abolitionism to new constituents. And the nation's most famous cruelty narrative, Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852, features several very incredibly cruel slaveholders who were also unkind to animal, beating animals as, a kind of amplification of their utter depravity. And so this kind of, reality also was embodied in the experiences that George Angel had as an attorney. His law partner was an abolitionist named Samuel Sewall. Harriet Beecher Stowe was one of his clients. And Sewall also funded William Lloyd Garrison's magazine, or the paper, The Liberator, as well. And he also represented John Brown. And so this is something that George Angel, as his law partner, would see these people coming in and out of the office. And so this too becomes really formative in terms of his own kind of connecting different issues to each other in a kind of synthesis. And in the context of antebellum movements against corporal punishment in schools and other public institutions, innovative new animal training manuals demonstrated the effectiveness of learning through kindness instead of fear. And the person I want to address here is a fellow by the name of John Solomon Rary. There he is. And he was an internationally famous great American horse tamer. And he gentled seemingly wild horses, incorrigible horses, in short, spectacular displays of gentling through kindness. And he used touch, habituation, reward, and a fundamental respect for equine intelligence as part of these performances that would draw huge crowds in the United States and in Europe. So this was a kind of spectacular performance, if you will. He avoided whips and spurs. He did use a strap. What he would do is he would hold up, as he's doing here, he had a strap that he would hobble one equine leg, and it would actually serve the purpose of making the horse feel more secure and would kind of relax in his presence. And horses would become docile. And so he had this kind of reputation as this extraordinary kind of almost supernatural power of gentling. And he wrote an international bestseller called The Modern Art of Taming Wild Horses in 1855. No copyright, so it was plagiarized all over the place. And he, like I said, was this kind of spectacular presence as a showman, but also as a gentling horse trainer. And he was also very influential as someone who worked with the Union Army, because horsepower was the way things were powered. You know, these long, long wagon trains with military supplies and other kinds of supplies, and of course, cavalry. And the treatment of horses in this mammoth Civil War was a cause for enormous concern. And so Rarey was brought in to try to, create some kind of better system out of this. Of course, it was incredibly difficult to do so, but he referred to it as his gospel of kindness. Now, he died of a stroke at the age of 38 years old in 1866, so very brief life, but he cast a long shadow on the humane movement. And George Angell had this to say about Rarey later on. He said, "The grandest preaching we ever had in Boston came from Rarey when he taught us the moral philosophy of love with reference to the horse." Unquote. And antebellum religiosity and reform created the foundation for a new social movement after the Civil War. But the Civil War had its own catalytic power in crystallizing this social movement after the war. And during the war, photography became a very important means of documenting the horrors of the battlefield. And this exhibition in New York City studio of Matthew Brady, known as the Cleo of the war, the photographer, photographing scenes that did not reveal war to be grand and spectacular, but to be what it was, deadly and horrific. And pictures, photographs of deceased horses and deceased people side by side in many cases, reinforcing this sense of kind of desolation to human beings and to animals that emerges in this kind of enormous conflict. So this was after the Battle of Antietam in 1862. And certainly the constitutional rights revolution that is at the center of the Civil War, enslavement to freedom and emancipation, impelled new thinking about suffering, property, bondage, and freedom in rebuilding a more merciful nation. And the penultimate moment for an organized animal welfare movement arrived on April 10th, 1866, when the New York legislature incorporated a groundbreaking state animal protection society vested with policing powers. This is the key, policing powers to prosecute abuse. It was founded and led by a shipping heir named Henry Bergh. His father had made a fortune in the War of 1812 selling, government contracts in shipping. And Henry was didn't know what to do with his life, but his family was very wealthy. He was appointed as the secretary of the legation in St. Petersburg, Russia in 1862. He goes there and he was appalled at what he saw. He saw a lot, it kind of saturated probably with stereotypes of darkest Russia in the American imagination in part. He was readily focused on instances of animal abuse that, of course, were going on in the United States as well. But he was focusing on what was happening there, and he would go and he would actually stand and say, "You should not abuse your horses." And people would look at him and say, "Who are you? Who are you?" Then he had a little light bulb moment. He put on his dress from the legation with his ribbons, his silks, and all his medals, and he strode outside one day and said, "Stop abusing the horses." Of course. So he realized the power of the uniform was an essential aspect of policing this movement. And so when he came back to the United States, he was in ill health in St. Petersburg. He got together with his friends, the historian George Bancroft, and among others, and they created the blueprint for legislation to create the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And so on April 10th, 1866, that day, the New York legislature incorporated the society, the ASPCA, and gave it policing powers. So this is an important point, not, left to the devices of local policing. They're overburdened. And so to have a special dedicated society to prosecute these laws, that became the issue. And weeks later, a new revised anti-cruelty law passes that actually, as Susan Pearson, a historian who's written about this as well, notes that it really recognizes animal suffering in a way that older laws had not. They recognized animals solely as property. And this law now recognizes animals as sentient beings, still property, but sentient with a right not to suffer. So that's an important intervention that happens. And so this kind of legal world expands to incorporate neglect as an offense, blood sports, and it just grows from there. And I want to say that Henry Bergh was over 6 feet tall. He was a bit of a dandy. He loved to dress well. And what he would do is he would literally place himself between drivers who are beating their horses, and he would say, "Stop and unload." And he would wear a top hat. So imagine this. He would stand about 6'5" in his uniform and his top hat, his badge. Horace Greeley, the newspaper editor, said there was no figure who was more visible on the streets of New York City than Henry Bergh. He's striding around all across the city. And so quite a visible kind of presence. And the thing that we have to remember in this era is that this is a muscle-powered world. It's an industrializing world, to be sure, and many of the machines that are, becoming useful in this age were still hauled by horses. So you have this kind of muscle-powered world that is slowly but surely giving way to motorization. But this kind of imagery in Our Dumb Animals as a kind of, this is how we can understand cruelty, is something you see a lot in these early years of the movement, in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, all the way really till the turn of the 20th century. The other thing you see too are images of urban stockyards. This is a time when the ecosystems of urban societies were very much animals, people, stockyards, dairies. Wall Street would have cows and pigs, being driven through the streets. And there were hours set as to when they could do that kind of driving of these livestock. So it's definitely a world that for us is somewhat unfamiliar. But this is also a world in which the act of building these giant urban stockyards, like the Union Stockyards in Chicago in 1865 when it opens on Christmas Day, what happened then was that animals would be driven by railroad, sometimes for hundreds, even 1,000 miles. And so one of the things that these new SPCAs does is that they focus on the conditions of transport to these urban stockyards, places like Chicago, places like Kansas City, St. Louis, and others, and establish the first federal, anti kind of animal welfare law dedicated to promoting care for these animals while they're in transport. And to us, it sounds like, wow, not very much standard of care. 28-hour law, meaning that an animal could not go for more than 28 hours without food, water, and rest. So that became law in 1873, revised in 1906 to have, more enforcement provisions. But it was definitely something that was very much a part of kind of reordering an urban industrial landscape of food production as well. And so what else did these folks do in these early years? They raided animal fights. They tried to end vivisection in laboratories and classrooms, so experimentation. They routinely shot decrepit workhorses as a merciful end to suffering. There's an irony here because the ASPCA from the 1880s to the 1890s had the ironic distinction of being responsible for shooting more horses than any other organization in New York City. And here's why. Stable owners insured their property, and they could only get paid for their insurance, collect on the insurance policy if they called someone else to do the shooting instead. And they would call the ASPCA and say, our horses are suffering. Please put them out of their misery. So it's one of those unintended consequences in a way. So one, I think, thing that's important to think about, in my early comment, I mentioned something about people claiming rights of citizenship through animal advocacy work. And one of the groups of people who really is at the center of this are women, okay? So women are involved in the movement from the get-go. You probably have noticed I've shown no pictures of women yet. I will momentarily. But this is a movement that was very difficult in many ways to assume a kind of leadership position because of the public nature of arresting and confronting animal abuse in public. So while Henry Bergh, with his top hat and his badge and his uniform, could be out in the world stopping horses, telling people to unload, for women who were involved in animal advocacy, that was a socially uncomfortable space. And so Caroline Earle White, she is someone I will talk about for a moment in several different places. So she actually, after the ASPCA was founded in 1866, she led the original petition drive to have an SPCA in Pennsylvania. And she was a successful person at it. But guess what she does immediately after getting in touch with the legislature and having the legislature successfully incorporate the society? She steps aside. She did not want to serve as its first president. She felt uncomfortable in that capacity. And she wrote to Henry Bergh, and this is what she had to say to him. If I were a man, I am quite sure that I should follow your example. But as it has pleased Almighty God to create me a woman, I must be satisfied with a more limited sphere of labor and do the little good I can with my tongue. So the realm of moral suasion as a kind of guardian of the domestic sphere was the realm that she felt that she could act within and remain a kind of social acceptability. And so I'll talk about the ways that she does this in just a moment. But one of the things that happens, though, a footnote, is that when women built institutions that were for women in the animal protection movement of this time, then they were very comfortable being leaders of that movement. And so 2 years later, she co-founds the Women's Pennsylvania SPCA. And she's perfectly happy to serve as president of that organization. And the other thing I would like to mention is her friend, Mary Frances Lovell. She was part of another women-led organization, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and its Department of Mercy. She was its national superintendent. And I'm going to talk much more about their work in a few minutes. But one of the things that I want to stress right now is the ways in which women's institutions, the kind of work they did, I will submit is probably the most lasting kind of legacy of the movement then today in terms of shaping the course of the movement. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about animal shelters, okay? This is the movement that these people lead in accord with a presence that's more inside rather than out in the streets prosecuting. So let's figure out, well, what was going on? Why this movement? Because I want to talk a bit about what things look like outside. And this was a time when stray animals were all over the place. And dogs in particular were a real social problem in urbanizing America. And, I know that that's certainly the case in other places as well. But during this time, in the summertime, in cities across America, the belief was that you round up the dogs in the summer because the prevailing kind of medical thinking of this day was that rabies proliferates in warm weather. So you hold these roundups in the summertime. And they were horrific events. The city pounds would open in the summer, and the dog catchers would go out and they would catch dogs, and it would be a gruesome affair. Sometimes shooting on sight, collecting bounties for dogs of 30 cents to 50 cents for each dog shot, or lassoed, rounded up, placed into carts, small dogs, big dogs, and taken en masse to these pounds, where if the dog was a mixed breed, it would be held for 48 hours without any kind of sustenance with all these other dogs, and then it would be killed. And killing in this time, in some places, if there was a river, meant mass drownings. So it was a very gruesome, gruesome time. There was a lot of social anxiety about rabies, outsized to the kind of reality of the disease. It's a horrific disease, but the incidence of rabies was much smaller than the perceived fear of the disease. One thing I just want to say as a kind of statistic, in 1911, in the first 8 months of the year, I was reading some of the New York City public health records, and 7 people did get rabies during that time, but over 10,400 people died of pneumonia. So, thinking about what scares people. And so this was something that in the, in this kind of urban world, dogs were scary. I mean, they ran in packs, and there was newspaper reportage that was terrifying. Here's 1903. Dog bites 9 persons. This is in Chicago. Big Newfoundland spreads terror downtown. Or rabies raging in Chicago. And, so just this sense of this kind of terror, even though the first rabies vaccine, Louis Pasteur, in 1885, successfully treats a boy in France with the rabies vaccine, it really trickles down for many years to canines and felines as well. There were muzzling ordinances, leashing ordinances, all of which, if violated, could lead to the death of a dog. So it was a very violent world, and dog catchers were appointed by mayors. And so just as an example, these are also cases where kind of the social worlds of poor people intersect with these dog catchers in really violent ways. And just as 3 examples, in 1877, Mrs. Sarah A. Ross, she was an African-American living in New York City. She refused to turn over her unlicensed dog to the dog catcher, and he threatened to have, quote, the satisfaction of seeing Sarah's dog hanged. And on August 10th, 1882, a dog catcher was incarcerated after killing a 14-year-old Harlem boy named James Doyle, who was shielding his dog in arms. And a group of boys, prior to this, the dog catcher was enraged because a group of boys saw him coming and they started throwing rocks at him, saying, "The dog catchers are coming, look out for your dogs, look out for your dogs." And that was an event that, this was something that in Irish neighborhoods, Irish American neighborhoods, dog catchers routinely harassed the neighborhood's Irish laborers, seizing and killing beloved, quote, mongrels of little value. So this kind of conflation of people and animals, ethnic others and dogs. One other instance I just want to mention. On July 14th, 1886, a dog catcher in pursuit of a small neighborhood Spitz on Hester Street in New York City. They were really going after this poor dog. Hundreds of Polish Jewish immigrants on Hester Streets besieged the dog catcher's carts and unhitched them, and then fired a pistol so the horses would run off. Well, what happened? One of the dog catchers actually shot someone and then was arrested for felonious assault. So these encounters around animals are also these flashpoints for social conflict. And this is something that we see, time and time again. And there's so much more to say about this, but I'll move on to say that the Women's Pennsylvania SPCA and related movements, they then, based on some of the things they saw going on at Battersea in England, actually, with sheltering, instituted reforms. So they instituted more humane methods of capture, year-round capturing, and putting small dogs in separate spaces, feeding and watering dogs, when they're actually in the space of what they renamed a shelter, and making adoption rather than unilateral killing the goal. Now, they did still euthanize dogs, but they really began this kind of movement toward placement. And by 1903, you already have no-kill shelters as well that are coming into existence. So it's remarkable. And these are led by women. All right, just saying that. Yes, led by women. And so this is something that, is a really important part of this movement. They also hired their own dog catchers, removing the mayoral appointee system, which was very corrupt. Kind of political favoritism. Yes. So at this stage in the movement, it wasn't as focused on children as it would be, but that becomes a centerpiece. So let's move on now to think about children. And this is a case, I'm curious how many of you know about this case? This is in the US, anyone know about this case? Okay, I'm so glad to hear this. Good, okay. So this is a case of a young girl named Mary Ellen Wilson. When she was 2 years old, she was an orphan child, a toddler, and she was living at Blackwell's Island Asylum in New York City. 2 years old. She was indentured to a couple, Mary and Francis Connolly, who wanted to indenture the girl with the hope that she would, as she grew, become a servant for them. So that's what they indentured her to become. Well, just within a few short years, the thin tenement wall separating the Connollys from the neighbor, who was a bed-bound older woman who received a Bible visitor named Etta Wheeler regularly to read to her, and she told Mrs. Wheeler, she said, "If there's one thing that must happen before I die, that little girl must get justice." Well, Wheeler went home and she said, wow. She spoke to the police. They said, "Sorry, it's a domestic matter. There's nothing we can do about it. We have to have evidence that she's actually being abused." She said, but the screams, the sounds of this girl being tossed against the wall, isn't that proof enough? So what did she do? She then talked to her family. He said, "You should talk to Mr. Berg. She is but an animal, surely. And so that's what she did. And Berg of the ASPCA and his legal counsel, Elbridge Gerry, a really good lawyer, were able to get Mrs. Conley, whose husband had passed by this time, arrested on felonious assault. And the trial was a spectacular case. The little girl, this is not a good image, but she has scissor marks all over her body. She was horribly abused. She was taken out of the home. Mrs. Conley was arrested, served prison time, and little Mary Ellen Wilson went on to live to be 90 years old or 92 years old when she finally passed. But she lived a happy life at that time. But what happens out of this event is that Elbridge Gerry, chief legal counsel to Henry Berg, what does he do? He founds the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. And just a few short years later, a group called the American Humane Association, which actually had formed to really deal with that transport of livestock that I talked about earlier, actually takes on a whole new role. What does it do? They decide to open amalgamated humane societies. And what does that mean? In the service of protecting children and animals. And so the interesting thing about this as a researcher is when researching these humane societies and looking in the archives. So in Minnesota, for example, I was at the Minnesota Humane Society, I was at the Historical Society reading the old ledgers. And one ledger talks about man was beating a horse and was arrested for beating the horse. Next entry, woman left children alone locked in the home all day. You know, it's just like side-by-side considerations of neglect and cruelty. So again, a very, kind of synthetic view of the world here. And children become the focus of the movement in the 1870s onward. They really become a central focus. I love this image. I loved it so much I used it on my book cover. But you can see here, barefoot children feeding those sheep that are bound to the stockyards. And they're the bare feet. It's this kind of bucolic scene confronting the industrial kind of world of animal transport and eventual slaughter. And then we see also, with this new focus on children, the growth of institutions related to children, such as Be Kind to Animals Week. 1915 onward, a whole week devoted to children's educational activities, poster making, kicked off by Humane Sunday, a kind of church service dedicated to animal kindness, and then a whole week of children's activities. And then another organization that takes shape related to children is a movement called the Bands of Mercy. So this is something that was created in 1882 when George Angel and an English minister, Thomas Timmins, they actually consolidated a kind of movement to bring kind of children's activities to churches, schools, and to form these bands. And so you see reports from India, for example, in missionary communities, in the Philippines, in Cuba, across the world, essentially, Turkey, Syria, Morocco, you name it, and they would be created out of this movement. And they also, one particular group that I want to focus on here is the band, the Gay Street Band. This was in Fort Worth, Texas, and led by one of the most remarkable people who I love to talk about. His name was F. Rivers Barnwell. He was a minister. You can see him here. I have a picture of him. There he is. And he was an incredible kind of animal protectionist who also was very much involved in African American civil rights issues as well. He was a leader in the NAACP. He was a leader of the Negro health movement. He worked for the Red Cross. He traveled across the state of Texas in the Jim Crow era in an automobile. And he gave lectures often to integrated audiences about animal kindness. It kind of flew under the radar of, what would otherwise cause great alarm, handing out copies of Our Dumb Animals that had explicit condemnations of violence against African Americans in its pages, giving them often to white supremacists in towns, like, here's a copy of Our Dumb Animals. You don't know what's inside this cover. And really quite a remarkable presence who I really think, I just want the world to know about him because he really was extraordinary. And there he is. And he was part of the Massachusetts SPCA's American Humane Education Society program. He and several other African American animal welfare leaders in the South, primarily in the United States, working in a kind of synthetic realm of animal kindness, civil rights issues, all at once. Also, speaking out against vivisection, animal experimentation, because of the shared histories of body snatching, poor people, also people of color, and then animals. So very much, again, thinking about these intersectional issues. Okay. And I just also want to talk about one more person who was part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Her name is Lucy Thurman, a founding member and also National Superintendent of Colored Work. She was such a force of nature as an animal advocate, so part of the Department of Mercy as well, and working among African American women in the WCTU in Texas to such a degree that the Black women's WCTUs were henceforth known as the Thurman WCTUs. So she's someone who, again, thinking about these shared kind of broader synthetic projects. Okay, so let's just see how we're doing here. I have a few more minutes of presentation, and then I'll hopefully have some time for a few questions. Okay, great. All right. So the other thing then that we have here is that as the United States becomes an empire at the turn of the 20th century, during the Spanish-American War era, George Angell was a fierce critic of American militarism. He wrote so many columns about, the dangers of American militarism. He hated Teddy Roosevelt, for example. He called him a half-crazed person. They got into an actual fight where Teddy Roosevelt ordered Our Dumb Animals taken off the shelves in Washington, D.C. And George Angell said, "Great, it improved sales. I'm so happy about that." But in any event, he was very much in favor of a project of American peaceable kind of expansionism, if you will, the spread of what he called American values. And with that, then, working with public schools in the Philippines, this is a little bit later, but instituting humane education regarding animal kindness into the curricula of Philippine public schools and in other parts of the empire as well. And this was something that was quite art projects, birdhouse building, nature study, proper animal husbandry, common elements of Philippine public education during the American occupation, training future citizens. So again, connecting these movements. Sometimes American efforts led to trouble. I'll very briefly talk about this. This is a postcard from Havana in Cuba, a cockfighting postcard, so circulating in public. And the Americans, in the military phase of its relationship in Cuba, its policies in Cuba, actually banned cockfighting in 1900. By 1906-07, it became a flashpoint as Cuban cockfighters being arrested as part of a general movement to overthrow the government of President Tomas Estrada Palma, and cockfighting petitions, huge processions across the country saying, we demand our right to cockfight. It is our national pastime. And eventually, the telegrams that I read at the National Archives in the States talk about this like, whoa, this has become a matter of presidential crisis here. And eventually, in 1909, the leaders of the pro-cockfighting kind of bring it back. One of them, Jose Miguel Gomez, became president and reinstitutes cockfighting following what had happened then in the Philippines, where it also had been banned during the American-Philippines War as a site of potential insurrection, and reinstituted and taxed. And that's what happened then in Cuba as well. Okay. All right. So, as the nation begins to hurtle in the 1920s and 30s to motorization, cars are everywhere, we see a new set of concerns on the pages of Our Dumb Animals. I hate this. This is, the dangers of automobiles. And Be Kind to Animals, Humane Sunday, again, Be Kind to Animals Week. If only that motorist who doesn't care had learned this. And we see a growing emphasis on pets, and we see a growing emphasis on animals in the movies and how they are treated. We also see a growing emphasis, as you see here, on the dangers of motorization. Amid a growing commercial pet-keeping culture, we see a growing emphasis on celebrities and animals. This is an era, too, in which medical care for human beings and animals is improving. Sulfonamides, antibiotics, all of these medicines are helping people and animals stay alive longer. Flea baths and a whole host of technologies allowing dogs and cats, who I'd love to talk about during the Q&A, entering into ever closer physical relationships on our beds, where they've remained ever since. And we see also less emphasis on religion. We've talked about this at our conference as America is secularizing. It's certainly happening here. With the repeal of prohibition in 1933, those older relationships with temperance, they fall apart. Also, social work, professionalizing, doing away with that animal connection in favor of professionalized social work. That happens as well. And so all of these older kinds of coalitions begin to fall away to a more focused approach on animals themselves. So that is something that I'll, think about, but there's also a way in which more recently there have been kind of returning back, I think, to that more kind of inclusive way of thinking. I've seen that. New York City, for example, the ASPCA, they decided to stop prosecuting. They're focusing on humane education, prevention. That is happening here, too, from everything I've read as well. More focus on prevention. And also, building coalitions to help people enjoy strong relationships with animals where they are, and helping people who may not have the means to care but can get that satisfying relationship through, again, a more synthetic approach. And when we think about this era that we've just talked about, I want to say that just recently I had the real pleasure to be part of an effort to memorialize Caroline Earle White. Her foundational role in the sheltering movement has now been honored with a marker in Pennsylvania, which is fantastic. I'm so happy. So Philadelphia is going to have a marker to her activities. However, Frederick Rivers Barnwell, whom I am such a huge fan, I have an article coming out about him. I shouldn't be talking like this, but I am a big fan of his. His legacy, in a sense, has been erased because the very physical places that he worked in defiance of Jim Crow, Texas, have been torn down to build highways. His whole vital neighborhood, African-American neighborhood, where animal advocacy was part of the cultural fabric of his community, torn down. His home, torn down, now a frontage road if you Google where he lived. And so it's that kind of remembering of the historical ways that people coped, the way they built coalitions, that I think are very instructive for us today as we think about all sorts of animal-related issues that, confront us, unite us, occasionally divide us, but are essential to our future on this planet. So with that, I'm going to stop, and I say thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. And I don't know if we have time for any questions, but I'd love to take some if we have like a... Oh, good. Okay, great. Oh, okay. Yeah, so anyone, or else if you just want to stand up and speak. Whatever you want. Yes?
The major question that springs to my mind is, do you feel that we've actually made much progress since the early 1800s? Are we, if there's cosmetic appearances of improvement,
Yeah.
is the improvement real, and how much?
Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, I do think that, in terms of, it just speaks to so many other issues of potential inequality. Like, I feel like I have several rescue dogs at my house, whom I miss very much, but they receive incredible medical care. So in that sense, the capacity to provide care is vastly improved, I would say. And I also would say that, like, in my community, for example, in Austin, Texas, No Kill has actually, I partner actually with the shelter in my teaching. I have a service learning course, and so they come and talk to us about the work they're doing, and I find it to be just absolutely incredible. I mean, they will provide transportation to people who can't afford to, take their animal to the vet. So thinking about meeting people where they are. So I think that is a source of incredible improvement. But there are still just huge, huge, huge challenges. And of course, I haven't even talked about kind of the distinction between animal welfare, about well-being, the prevention of pain and suffering, versus animal rights, and thinking about animals as, beings that perhaps, there's a move to petition for legal standing in court in the States. And, so that's a whole other frontier of the movement too. It's as it's enormously complicated, vast movement that in many respects I would say definitely technologically with medical care, great. But in other ways, I think, work is ongoing. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. That was incredible.
Thank you.
I felt like there was a lot of focus on animals that are in people's everyday lives.
Yes.
Pets.
Yes.
Where does it, I don't know if this is past your study, but
No,
where
no.
does it come to the picture? Like now there's a lot of focus on deforestation and a lot of those side of things. Does this start coming around the same time?
It totally does. Yes, actually. And so one group of animals that I didn't talk about at all, birds. Birds are so central to this story, and I know they're central to the story here, and thinking about 2050 and the whole, the stoats, the possums, and the rats eradication. And then I've been reading this morning, jet lag. I was up at about, 4 or 3 in the morning, just riveted by all of the reading about cats, too, in all of this, too. And so back in the day, indeed, people were very ecologically, concerned about the kind of broader web of life, because this is the age in the early 20th century where you see extinctions are happening. So in 1914, as an example, the last passenger pigeon passes away. And when you say this one passenger pigeon, it belies this whole history of literally billions of birds filling the skies, changing the weather, volleys of, hailstorms as they're passing over. I mean, just this world of incredible, my great-grandfather remembered seeing wild flocks of passenger pigeons, and he died in 1955. He was actually born in Australia, and so that was an important event. And so what we're seeing by the early 20th century is this, the product of this massive industrialization. Also, the bird hat craze. So, huge, voluminous confections, these hats, with just piles of birds on top of them. This is something that, with the people who would hunt them, they would go to these rookeries in places like Florida and just boom, boom, boom. These herons are just sitting there. And so that too becomes this kind of crisis of, we're not in a world of extraordinary, endless animal abundance. And, in a way, thinking back to Perry Miller, who is the American scholar that we've been dealing with at our conference, talking about the howling wilderness and talking about kind of this land of extraordinary animals and so many of them. We're seeing in this era a kind of reckoning with the costs of what we're doing. So yeah, it starts early. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
No, thank you for your talk.
Yes.
I was just wondering, sort of following on from that.
Yeah.
There's a sort of tradition of animal rights movements in Australia.
Sure.
Peter Singer,
Yeah.
Jan Kirksayer has been very active.
Yeah.
And there's also, of course, one in the United States, Carrie Wolf,
Mm-hmm.
in Rice,
Yeah.
Texas, and Donna Haraway has been very active.
Yeah.
Do you think there are particular similarities and differences between the emphases in those kind of movements?
I do, yeah. I mean, so one thing that in the early years of the movement that I would say, I'm not so sure about Donna Haraway, but Carrie Wolf and like Mark Beckhoff and, a whole host, Peter Singer, that one of the litmus tests in today's movement, the animal rights movement, is it would be very hard to be a meat eater in today's kind of, thinking about, are we really, walking the walk, talking the talk? Back in the day, most of the people that I'm writing about actually did eat meat. However, and this is where the kind of transnational kind of flows of knowledge and contact come into play. So India was a site of tremendous activity for a lot of the people that I write about. And they worked with Indian nationalists. Pandita Ramabai, she came, gave a smashing tour in the United States. She was a vegetarian animal advocate. Swami Vivekananda, when he comes and speaks at the Parliament of Religions at Chicago in 1893, he's someone who is also talking about vegetarianism. And so what we see happening is key strands. So Mary Frances Lovell, whom I mentioned earlier, she was very close friends with an Indian animal advocate, Labshankar Lakshmi Das, and they would correspond all the time. He was a vegetarian, and she went to the Chicago stockyards, the Union stockyards, and her kind of knowledge of her friendship with Labshankar Lakshmi Das really crystallized at that moment. It was one of those click moments where she said, I'm done. I can never eat meat again. So you see through these contact points and also the industrialization of meat production that's happening in the early, really after the Civil War especially, a kind of growing strand of the movement that really resembles most closely today's activists, I would say. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for your lecture.
You're welcome.
I'm really interested that the animal welfare, the animal cruelty preceded the child cruelty.
Yeah.
That was really interesting.
Yeah.
To hear that. And you might be very interested to know that there's a new charity being established in New Zealand where there has been shelters for abused women and their children many years now.
Yes.
to kill the animals or do something. So they're now setting up a shelter where the animal can be taken away as well.
Oh my goodness.
To facilitate. So it's a very circular
That is amazing.
relationship.
Thank you. I'm
It's just literally happening. There's one of the New Zealand builders has donated the land and building the shelter, which would be a secret location.
yes. Of course, yeah. And I think that's such a great example. Yeah, and it actually reminds me in a way of one of the tragedies in recent American history was Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Just the utter collapse of infrastructure and the kind of way that hurricane laid bare so many structural forms of inequality. And people who were, essentially, they would not evacuate because they wanted to be with their animals. And the rescuers would not let them take them. And yet at the same time, then there was this whole movement to rescue animals that had seemingly been abandoned. So it was just this horror. And the thing is, there was a custody case in Austin that was just wrenching that I followed, between a woman who owned a dog named Jazz and then another woman who rescued Jazz, renamed Hope. They went to court many times. The dog was finally returned to her original owner, a New Orleanian. But, it was just a terrible case. And so since then, that's something, thinking about how things can get better. Hurricane Harvey that blew into Houston, the whole issue of pet keeping and taking animals with people as they evacuated was absolutely standard practice. So that's speaks to, the whole issue of continued hurricanes, but nonetheless, understanding that, this is a sign of that same kind of circle of thinking, where it's all synthetic, all connected, and all deeply important to the fabric of society. So I know we're out of time, but thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.